Hello dear viewers. Today, we've just experienced a deeply emotional story about James and Diep, two colleagues on a business trip abroad who suddenly faced a terrifying emergency on their flight. In a moment of life and death, amidst screams and chaos, they held each other's hands and prayed. And then, a miracle happened. The plane made a safe emergency landing, and they narrowly escaped death. After the ordeal, James and Diep knelt down to give thanks to God for protecting them. That moment not only changed the way they saw life but also brought their hearts closer together than ever before. If this story touched your heart and left a meaningful impression, don't forget to hit the like button, share the video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more emotional and human stories like this one. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. The hum of the engines had been steady, a soft background noise as James flipped through a report on his tablet. Beside him, Diep leaned her head against the window, watching the soft wisps of cloud drift by. They were flying at 35,000 feet, en route to a business conference in Switzerland, their first overseas work trip together. The cabin was calm, even peaceful. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles. A few passengers were already asleep. Then it happened. A loud bang erupted from somewhere beneath the aircraft. The entire plane jolted violently to one side, sending cups, pens, and bags flying. The lights above flickered. Gasps filled the air. Diep shot upright, her eyes wide with panic. James instinctively grabbed her hand. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Before he could respond, a second jolt rocked the plane. The fasten seatbelt signs lit up in crimson. An oxygen mask dropped with a mechanical hiss in front of them. Others followed. All around, passengers fumbled with the dangling masks, pulling them over their mouths and noses. Children cried. A woman screamed. Over the intercom, the captain's voice came on, shaky, strained. "This is your captain speaking. We've lost power in one engine. We are making an emergency descent. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." James reached for Diep's mask, pulling it down for her and adjusting it over her nose with trembling hands. His other hand never left hers. She was shivering now, staring at him with tears welling in her eyes. "I'm scared, James," she choked out, her voice muffled beneath the mask. "I'm here," he replied firmly, locking eyes with her. "We're going to be okay. Just hold on." But even as he said it, James didn't believe it himself. The aircraft pitched again, losing altitude rapidly. Looking out the window, all he could see was clouds and flashes of sunlight. Somewhere far below, there was Earth, cold, hard, and terribly distant. The feeling of helplessness wrapped around him like a noose. He wasn't in control. Not of the plane. Not of their lives. Diep clutched her necklace, a simple silver cross, and closed her eyes. Lips moving silently, she began to pray. "Dear God, please, please protect us. Don't let this be the end." Her voice trembled as she mouthed the words, and something about the rawness of it, her fear, her faith, broke something open in James. He had always believed in logic, in control, in reason. But here, at the mercy of failing machinery and gravity. There was no room for logic. Only surrender. Only hope. He closed his eyes, gripping Diep's hand even tighter, and whispered, "God, if you can hear me, please keep her safe. I'll take anything, just don't take her from me." The cabin was chaos, flight attendants trying to calm people, some passengers sobbing, others frozen with fear. The plane rattled with each gust of turbulence as it continued its descent. The sky outside had turned a darker gray. Storm clouds. James opened his eyes and looked at Diep again. Despite the fear in her eyes, there was a calmness about her now, the kind that only came from believing in something greater. She reached over and placed her other hand over his heart. "We're not alone," she said softly. For a brief second, it felt like time stood still. Amid the roaring engines, the crying, the alarms, there was a quiet space, just for them. And in that moment, James felt something stir in his chest. Not just fear. Not just love. But faith. The plane continued its descent, the roar of the remaining engines struggling to keep the aircraft stable. Every dip felt like a free fall. Each second stretched into eternity. From every corner of the cabin came prayers in different languages, whispered confessions, frantic calls to loved ones that would never connect. James could feel the tremble in Diep's hand, though she was trying to stay composed. Suddenly, another shudder rattled the fuselage. The lights blinked off for a moment, pitch black engulfed them, then flickered back on. Someone yelled in terror. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned, this time more urgent. "We're attempting an emergency landing at a nearby airstrip. Brace position. I repeat, assume the brace position now." The flight attendants shouted the command again, their professional tones betraying a flicker of fear. James and Diep did as they were told, leaning forward, heads down, hands gripping the seats in front of them. Diep's breathing was ragged beneath her oxygen mask, but she kept whispering a prayer, over and over. "Please, Lord, please let us land safely." James didn't pray this time, not with words. Instead, he closed his eyes and pictured every moment he'd taken for granted, her laughter echoing in their office late at night, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the time she fell asleep on his shoulder during a late flight home. If this was the end, he wanted to carry those memories with him into the dark. The wind howled louder now as the plane broke through heavy cloud cover. Below them, the outlines of buildings and fields appeared, salvation within sight. The plane was still descending too fast, but the runway was visible now, a strip of hope carved into the earth. "Hold on!" James shouted to Diep over the noise. The wheels struck the tarmac with a deafening thud. A jolt surged through the cabin as the landing gear hit the ground hard. Luggage compartments burst open. Screams erupted. Sparks flew past the windows. The aircraft skidded sideways, tires screeching, smoke rising. The cabin shook like it would rip apart. Then, silence. A groan of metal. A hiss of escaping steam. But the plane had stopped. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, one by one, passengers began to sob, laugh, gasp for air. A woman clapped her hands together and shouted, "We're alive! We made it!" Diep sat up slowly, trembling all over. Her mask had fallen off. Her eyes met James's, and in that gaze was every emotion that words couldn't hold. Relief, disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. James reached for her and pulled her into his arms. She collapsed into his chest, shaking with silent tears. "We're alive," she whispered. "James, we're alive." The flight attendants moved quickly, ushering people out through the emergency exits. The smell of burnt rubber and jet fuel filled the air. Outside, fire crews and ambulances were already on the scene. James and Diep exited hand in hand, stepping down the emergency slide onto solid ground. For the first time in hours, they could breathe without fear. Diep dropped to her knees on the grass beside the runway and lifted her eyes to the sky. James knelt beside her. "Thank you," she whispered to the heavens, her hands clasped tightly. "Thank you for saving us." James said nothing at first. He just looked up into the overcast sky, feeling the dampness of the earth beneath his knees and the weight of something sacred pressing on his heart. Finally, he whispered, "Thank you for not letting her go." And in that moment, as the sirens wailed in the distance and the wind carried away the smoke, James and Diep knew they had been part of a miracle. That night, the hotel room was quiet, yet filled with an energy neither James nor Diep could explain. Outside, the foreign city buzzed with life, distant traffic, flickering neon, voices in a language they barely understood. But inside, time moved differently. Slower. Softer. Like the world had paused to let them breathe. Diep sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn on the plane. Her hair was tousled, her eyes rimmed red. In her hands was the silver cross necklace, the one she'd clutched during the worst moments of the flight. James stood by the window, watching the lights outside. He hadn't spoken much since they left the airport. Something in him had shifted, something too deep for casual words. After a while, he turned around. "I still hear it," he said quietly. "The sound of the engine failing. That silence, right before we hit the ground. I can't stop replaying it in my head." Diep nodded slowly. "Me too. Every time I close my eyes." She looked up at him, her gaze steady despite the lingering fear. "But we're here. And we didn't get here on our own." James walked over and sat beside her. Their hands found each other again, instinctively, gently. She placed his hand over her necklace. "I don't know if you believe in miracles," she said softly, "but I do. After today, I don't just believe. I know." James was quiet. For years, he had lived by logic, by facts and plans and strategies. Faith was something abstract, something for others. But now, after brushing up against death, something within him felt cracked open. Wider. Humble. "I saw you praying," he said. "And I wanted to believe like you. I didn't know how, but I tried." She smiled faintly. "That's all faith is. Just trying to believe, even when everything is falling apart. For a moment, silence settled between them, warm, not heavy. Then Diep gently slipped off the bed and knelt on the floor. She looked up at James, eyes filled with a quiet invitation. "Will you pray with me?" He hesitated, just for a second. Then he joined her, kneeling beside her on the soft carpet. Their hands clasped. Diep closed her eyes and whispered, "Heavenly Father, we come before you tonight not with fear, but with gratitude. You held us in your hands when we were falling. You heard our cries when there was no one else to hear them. And you brought us back. Not just to the ground, but to each other." Her voice trembled, but she went on. "Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for the strangers who helped, for the pilot's courage, for every breath we're still able to take. Let us never forget how fragile life is, and how precious." James opened his eyes slowly, overwhelmed by emotion. For a long time, he couldn't speak. But then, in a low voice, he whispered, "Thank you for giving me another day with her. That's more than I ever deserved." Tears streamed down Diep's face, but she smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up the dim room. When they rose, it wasn't just from the floor. It felt like they had risen from something deeper, from fear, from doubt, from everything that nearly took them. They stood in the stillness of the night, holding each other as if for the first time. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the window pane. Life moved on. But for James and Diep, this night would never be just another night. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one written not in fear, but in faith, love, and gratitude.